Hey everyone, my name's Adam and I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist for Let's Talk. Now I'm doing another video in my backyard. I'm going to talk to you about a type of therapy which I think might be quite useful at this time, called behavioural activation. Now behavioural activation is something we use quite a lot really in CBT, usually to treat depression, but also I think it's really quite powerful for people who struggle with low confidence and low self-esteem. And it's a very behaviourally driven intervention. So that's the B of CBT, aimed at sort of increasing confidence and improving mood. So I'm going to go through sort of just the key principles of it really, because I think even though we're on lockdown, so in some ways it's never been harder to implement behavioural activation. I also think at the same time it's never been more important. The reason we use behavioural therapy is because there's a really strong connection between what we do, our behaviour, and how we feel. Now usually someone will come in for therapy based on how they feel, because they feel bad or they feel anxious or low in mood. So what we look at is how these feelings start to impact on how someone actually lives their life, how someone behaves. If you was to compare what you did on a good day, where you feel confident and happy, with a not so good day, where you're feeling low in mood, the behaviour will be very different. When we feel naturally happy, confident, we tend to engage with the things that matter to us a lot more. Versus when we feel down or depressed, we tend to withdraw from those things and feel quite disconnected from any activity that's usually good for our mental health. So for instance, if you imagine someone who was feeling quite low or feeling quite stressed, started to react in this sort of way, where they started to withdraw from people, avoid certain activities, neglect their own self-care, started to ignore problems like burying their head in the sand, or just started to worry more as a result of doing less of the things that they actually valued, then what tends to happen is each of these behaviours will feed that person's stress, will feed low mood or even depression. So in a way we have a very vicious cycle nature in terms of how these sort of behaviours would feed a problem. Now behavioural activation itself is looking at cutting out this vicious cycle. In CBT often that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at necessarily what started a problem, but we're looking at what keeps it going. And if we're thinking about low mood and stress, some of the things behaviourally that will keep these going generally seem to be around avoidance or things that actually make us feel worse. Generally what we're looking for in BA is increasing our nourishing activity. So it's not just about increasing how much we do. It's not just about cramming and keeping busy all the time. For some people, it might be about letting go of some of that busyness and really sort of simplifying life, particularly whilst we're on lockdown, making sure that the most important things, the things that we value in life, are being tended to and not neglected. So within that line, often what we're looking at for nourishing activity are things that tend to give us a sense of achievement, so it makes us feel proud about stuff, or give us a sense of pleasure or fun in things. So achievement and pleasure, but also having a sense of closeness and feeling connected to other people is really, really difficult right now, for particularly if you're self-isolating. But again, I think the harder it is, usually the more important something is. So in Let's Talk, we deliver classes called Stress Control. And when we teach about behavioural activation, we tend to talk about it as 3 A's. The first A that we need to look at is activity. So this is actually what we're doing. And the second A is attention. So that's where our actual mind is focused upon during activity. And the third one is attitude. But we'll start on activity. So generally what we need to do is reflecting on what sort of activity we're doing in our life. If you was to reflect on the last week or even the last few days, which of these activities have been nourishing for you, for your mental health, and which ones have you found depleting? Now this is really hard at the minute because probably a lot of the things that you do that are quite nourishing might be quite restricted because of social distancing or lockdown, or if you're isolating. Born to golf, forced to work from home. So it's really difficult. We have to be quite inventive, really, when we're thinking about activities, the things that are giving us a sense of pleasure or a sense of achievement. I mean, things like even like exercise, so much harder to do in the current context, particularly if you're self-isolating. Now, everyone knows that it's important to exercise for your physical health. However, I think often people don't appreciate just how important exercise is for our mental health. Now, for me, it's a much more attractive prospect to exercise if it's going to make me feel better mentally, if it's going to make me feel more confident and feeling as though your mood's more balanced. And we're not talking about running marathons. You don't need to join a gym. You're not allowed to join a gym right now. You have to settle for being inventive in the home. I'm going to talk about how we would approach behavioural activation normally in normal circumstances, but we have to be thinking outside the box. Now, because we're all individuals and we all have our own different likes and interests, there's no point in me reeling off loads of things for you to try because it might not necessarily fit you. However, what I would say is we're looking for those core conditions such as pleasure, achievement, and sense of closeness. So in terms of pleasure, I've tried getting back into playing chess, but it's been difficult because I've only had myself to play, and even then still keep losing. I've had a go at baking, not really my forte, to be fair, but it's one of those things that can give you some sort of sense of achievement, even if it tastes awful. There's so many different things out there. Really, it's about finding the thing that works for you. And in my opinion, you need to try a number of things before you really find the right thing. Breaking eggs before making an omelette and all that. For those who maybe bury the head in the sand, procrastinate a lot, is get thinking about some of the things that you've been putting off. Usually, we put things off that are unpleasant, that are quite distressing or stressful to do. However, by putting them off, we tend to sort of prolong our agony of having to deal with these. And sometimes something that was kind of small problem can expand. So what we generally do with behavioural activation is really think about what are those things that you're putting off, because we're relying on the notion that it's not about always doing pleasant things. It is about doing things that give us a sense of achievement as well. So sometimes, if you've got those things that need doing around the house, or that difficult phone call that you might need to make, these are hard and not necessarily fun. But actually, when we're talking about self-esteem and how we feel mentally, these can be really powerful things to do. So once you've generated a decent list, whether it's hobbies that you used to do that you don't do anymore, or new things that you're going to try, things you've always wanted to do, something you're going to learn, whatever, now is time for putting that into practice. Now, if you are a bit of a procrastinator, easy for you to say, this step really shouldn't be skipped. We're talking about making a bit of a contract with ourselves. Now, if you have on your activity list, clean the full house, that's generally psychologically going to feel too much. We're looking to really simplify things and break things down into the smallest parts. You've heard the old expression, making mountains out of molehills. With behavioural activation, what we advocate is making molehills out of mountains. Really simplifying and making a task which might seem mountainous seem more psychologically manageable. It doesn't matter how small it is. The idea is just to get the ball rolling with something. But we want to be very specific about that activity. We want to be realistic about what it is. But we also want to be picking a specific time. So what day we're going to do this, and what time we're going to start it, and how long are we going to do this for. Now, once you've set in an activity, one thing that I always find really important is to get some good sort of feedback. Like, is this behavioural activation malarkey going to be helpful for me and managing my mood and stress level? A simple way to find out is start to reflect on what your mood was like or how you was feeling before doing that activity, and then reflect on how you felt afterwards. So some people rate their mood almost from 0 being low, 10 being really, really positive. and then re-rate it at the end. And what we're looking for is like an improvement of this. Other people prefer to describe how they felt because it's a bit more complicated than just 0 to 10. However you do it, I just want you to reflect on how that activity has affected you, whether this behaviour has changed how you feel or even how you think about stuff. And even sort of unpleasant activity can have really positive results. You know, if we're thinking about washing up or doing a house or unblocking drains or whatever, then not very pleasant. However, the sense of achievement we can get from that can be really powerful and really good for mental health. But sometimes it could be doing something for someone else. There's plenty of opportunities for some people who are fit and able to volunteer at this time, but it might just be checking in on people that we sometimes forget about when we're in times of distress and threat. Family members, friends, just checking in, trying to keep that connectedness. We would encourage you to try and connect and reach out to people who are important to you and who you value. And like I said, you can rate your mood, or you can rate how much pleasure or sense of achievement or sense of closeness it gives you. The idea is you treat that like an appointment. So when that time and date comes, you do that in spite of how you feel. Because if you go based on feelings and you don't feel motivated or you don't feel like doing something, tendency is to procrastinate and think, I'll do it when I feel good. Whereas what we're doing here is we're acting in spite of our feelings, not because of them. Now, some people who just do that activity level of behavioural activation, sometimes will come back in therapy and say, well, I'm doing all the right things. You know, I'm putting all these things that I should be doing in, and I don't feel any different. And sometimes when we really explore this and look at it a bit closer, it's partly because of attention, and that's our second A. So attention refers very much to being mindful in regards to the activity, because we can easily go through the motions and go on autopilot. You know, how many people who drive have driven somewhere and got to their destination and you can't really remember getting there? That's not because you closed your eyes and you just luckily got there. It's because you went onto autopilot, which is really useful for doing boring, mundane tasks. But if we're looking at increasing nourishment in activity, it's massively important that we are mindful whilst we're doing it. Sometimes as human beings, we try to do too many things at once. Whereas with mindfulness, it's very much almost like about single tasking, doing one thing at any point and really putting our minds, our body into it. If we're doing too many things at once, if we're trying to multitask, then we're generally doing a lot of things not that well. With mindfulness, a really easy way to kind of describe it for those who've never done it or heard of it before, is very much about being in the moment and single tasking, doing that one thing at that time and really immersing all of your senses into it. Often when we're thinking about anxiety, our mind's in the future. With depression, sometimes we dwell on past losses and things we wish were different. Mindfulness is very much about bringing attention to the present moment, which is really key if behavioural activation is going to work. The final layer that I'm going to talk about is attitude. Now, attitude is about our expectation versus reality. So in lockdown, we might put a lot of undue expectation and pressure on ourselves, how we should be reacting. We might look at other people on social media and think, oh, look at them. They're making amazing cookies and baking bread with their family and teaching their kids algebra. And look at me, struggling really, figuring out how many animals went to the river. If we're beating ourselves up about that, then sometimes the pressure and the expectations we're putting on ourselves in these quite unprecedented times is too high. Now, if you're a perfectionist, this will be even more so. Really, with perfectionism, we set unachievable or unrealistic goals in the first place, or things that maybe we can do for a little while but are unsustainable in the long term. Things like always keeping you cool emotionally, probably not going to happen on lockdown, or being really good at homeschooling, or being able to do the work to the same level from home as you did previously. Really, if your expectations are too high, then the reality is never going to meet it. The reality is we just start to focus on how we want things to be different, not how things actually are. So changing and addressing your attitude when we talk about behavioural activation is about acceptance of how things are right now. Things may change and we might want them to be better, but when we're doing behavioural activation, it's not about being judgmental and putting so much pressure on yourself for things to be perfect. So if you are trying something new for the first time, don't beat yourself up if you don't enjoy it first time or you don't grasp it straight away. It takes a long time sometimes for us to really get into something and start to build confidence, and then we can start to enjoy something new. So really, attitude is about being quite compassionate to your context, to your situation, and to yourself as well, because you're not going to be perfect throughout this. So in conclusion, behavioural activation is a behavioural intervention tool, usually for depression and low self-esteem, but I think it's just important generally for all of us all of the time, particularly during this pandemic. If you're looking at changing your activity, make sure you do pay attention and be aware of this sort of attitude trap that we can get in, where we set unrealistic expectations for ourselves. So that was really a crash course in behavioural activation. Lots of things for you to digest, but really powerful if you start to use them. Now we'll be sharing some resources, particularly for those of you who want to take much more of a guided self-help approach, but do get in touch with Let's Talk if you're struggling with depression or stress levels or anxiety. We're here to support people to improve and maintain good mental health. Take care.